Okay, our last story is about how moms on the autism spectrum, may be passing down the gene more than dads. Um, and I think the takeaway for me of this article was more about the fact that we're seeing this trend that sometimes one or more parent after their child gets diagnosed and it's being explained to them what autism is. I think all parents go, well, wait a second, I do that. Wait a second, I have that. Or wait a second, my husband has that. And I think it's really important for us to, I think for a lot of time, we were saying things like, well, we're all somewhere on the spectrum. If you look at all of the different criteria for autism, we're hoping Nancy joins us back. But if you look at all the criteria for autism, everybody has something on the criteria. And I think that that's really, really true. It's really important that we all acknowledge that you don't get a diagnosis of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, unless you have enough of the things, and those things have to be something that disrupts your life significantly to the point where you need support. That's really when you get the diagnosis of autism spectrum. There's Nancy.
I'm back.
We moved on to the last story, and I was just saying the takeaway for me of the last story is that don't you find that a lot of times when people get their child diagnosed to them, that they start to go, wait a second, but you're describing me, or now you're describing my spouse, and
Right.
I think it's important to talk about it and look at it, and even to the point of we're seeing more and more, especially moms, but sometimes dads, who find themselves going to see if they qualify for a diagnosis.
Right.
And I, for one, I want to be really careful at this point and not have. I I find I'm a little sensitive when people assume that they're on the autism spectrum, because I think it negates a little bit the disorder part of it. That I do think that we're all a little bit on the spectrum, and that we all need a little bit of support and things, but it doesn't disrupt our life greatly. And I do think that we need to be cognizant of the difference, right? And so sometimes people will say, well, I haven't gone to get a diagnosis. I'm self-diagnosing. I think that I'm on the autism spectrum because I have X, Y, and Z. And I would encourage people to go slowly with that role. But I think that we all need to acknowledge where we're having difficulties. And if you need help, seek out and get it. And if that means getting a diagnosis, then by all means.
Right.
But I don't think it's unusual. There is an expression in the autism community that puppies don't have kittens.
Right. Right.
And, our children, and we can argue nature versus nurture, that sometimes our kids pick up our habits, right, of dealing with things, and sometimes our kids genetically are predisposed to different things. Jim and I definitely see in each other where the ways in which neither one of us qualifies for a diagnosis, but I have different traits. Like I see that I have sensory issues, right? And he sees that I have sensory issues, but not to a degree that I can get a diagnosis of sensory processing disorder. Although I've had guests who tell me I should go and get officially tested for that, but and maybe I will someday. But I think that and maybe you can speak to this, Nancy, that, I think you've been very open about the fact that you and your wonderful husband, Reed, adopted Wyatt, that he was a blessing that came to you in a different way.
Yeah.
No less meaningful, but you don't share genetic material,
Right.
but he is your child and he has grown up in your household. And he is uniquely Wyatt because, he's your child. I have never, when I met Wyatt, I don't know how old he was, but he was making himself a cup of coffee. And I've never forgotten that, because I didn't know any other kid that age that was making themselves a cup of coffee. But that is so Wyatt, and that is so your household. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So anyway, I want to encourage people to be looking at that, not overreacting. And if you feel that you need a diagnosis or to have it checked, it's more and more possible for adults to do that. It's not quite as difficult as it used to be. But I do think it's interesting that that they're seeing genetically that it might be more from the mom than from the dad.
Right. Right.
Um, I don't know. I always get a little sensitive about that, Nancy. Um, I remember thinking very distinctly because of some people in my family, as Jem was starting to be diagnosed, I remember thinking, okay, this is from my genes, not from my husband's,
Hmm.
and feeling like it was my quote unquote fault.
Right.
I've been able to relanguage in that in my head, so that thought seems so foreign to me now. But I know that a lot of people get hung up in that.
Right.
Like whose fault is it? And why? And there's a part in Christina Adams' book, A Real Boy, which I absolutely love. And it talks about something happens and she finds out something statistically like this, that it's more likely to come from the mom. And her ex-husband said to her, well, yeah, I always figured he got it from you.
Uh-huh.
And it was devastating to her in that
Right.
moment. And I can remember reading that and just sobbing because I thought, oh, I don't want it to be my fault. I really
Uh-huh.
don't look at it that way at all anymore. I don't think of it as I really have, our topic this week, Nancy, was acceptance versus contentment.
Right.
And I really do believe that I have come to complete acceptance that my child, this was the path that we were meant to be on. And I don't ever think about, well, what if my child had not been diagnosed with autism?
Uh-huh.
That's gone from the table for me. I accept it. This was our
Right.
path. This was the only way that it ever could be. And so there's nothing wrong. There's no fault. There's no blame. Um, I'm not always in contentment with things and those things that I work on, but I fully, and it's so interesting how you can be one day not in acceptance and the next day be in
Yeah,
acceptance.
it's a process.
Yeah. And I liken it to when my father died. And I was 30 years old and I'd never had anybody that close to me pass away before. And I couldn't get my head wrapped around it. I just couldn't. I wanted to argue it. I would write things about, well, but if he lived longer, and it was this whole, I couldn't accept that that was it, that my father had died and there was no more. I just couldn't get my head wrapped around it. And then a day came where it washed over me and I realized he's gone. He's never going to be able to be back the way that he was. And it's time to accept that. I don't have to like it, but I can't argue it anymore. There's nothing to argue. It happened. I can't go back. And then I was able to figure out how I could live the rest of my life. Because when
Mhm.
you're not in acceptance of something, and it was the same thing for Jem. There were a lot of days that my whole day was, how can I get back to the day, the place, the time when whatever happened happened and change it?
Oh, I know. I was consumed in the beginning with that thought that
Yeah.
if I could go back and blaming myself.
Yes. And I
Yeah.
just couldn't, I couldn't make any peace with it because and I see this in other areas of my life where there's time when I'm like, I just want to do over. Can we
Right.
just rewind the tape? I want to go back. I want to do it differently. I want to look at it differently. And it isn't until I can look at something and go, okay, I can't argue that anymore. That piece of it happened. And I have to be out of the argument of that, be in the acceptance of that, and now I can figure out what to do about it, which that is that acceptance versus contentment piece for me.
Mhm.
I'm I I always feel a little strangled, like I can't be in acceptance, and then I remind myself acceptance doesn't mean you're happy with it.
No.
I'm allowed to not be in contentment, but I know the quicker I can get to acceptance, the better I'm going to be and the more effective I'm going to be in doing whatever it is that I'm going to do.
Right.
So anyway, um, so I hear you guys. You guys have been saying that this is a little bit for you as well. We are officially out of time,
Okay.
but I want to say that we are back next week. Hey, thanks for watching Autism Live. To subscribe, click here. And if you'd like to check out some more of our videos, click here.